Hello and welcome. This is Gabriel Custodiet of Watchman privacy practitioner, consultant, author, and frontline fighter in the push for privacy. I know why you're here. Like the rest of us here in the resistance, you're trying to escape the technocratic apparatuses that you see enveloping you and crushing your freedoms. That's why I created all of this, all without sponsors. I hope you enjoy this show, but then when you're ready to take the next steps to secure your privacy and your future, visit my website, escapethetechnocracy.com, to start the real journey. Your support alone determines the future of the show. See you there. I'm very pleased today to be joined by the person that I go to when I want to hear what's happening in Bitcoin, some of the chaos that's going on, get a different perspective on things. This is Max Tannahill, back for the fifth time on the show, repeat guest friend of the show. Max Tannahill, welcome. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks so much for having me on again, Gabriel. Always a pleasure, and certainly always fun to kind of be able to have a kind of a bit of a chat about Bitcoin and the space generally. And yeah, I really appreciate a chance. I always get good feedback from people after they've listened to the show, and yeah, it's good because I'm often on like Twitter or Signal or Telegram having discussions with people, but there's certainly a whole bunch of people out there that tend to kind of only get the time to catch up on stuff on podcasts. So it's a really nice opportunity to this, and thanks very much.
Absolutely. And obviously we're not trying to put too much pressure on you, but you do represent a very powerful minority opinion within Bitcoin that doesn't get the time of day very often. So very much like to magnify that. And of course, if people have any pushback, they can reach out to us. Max is every day responding to people on Twitter and elsewhere. So just good to get a different perspective here. Let's start with Samourai Wallet. So Samourai Wallet, I guess it's their sentencing will be happening in November 6th. What happens between our last conversation and now is that they have pled guilty. And my understanding, Max, in this is that the way that the justice system works in the U.S. is they were facing all this crazy time, right? And if they were going to fight against that, I guess that they realized that they probably didn't have a good percent chance of winning that fight. And it's not necessarily because of what they did. You have to factor into the judge's history. There's all sorts of things that go in. So my assumption is that they said, we have we're better off pleading guilty, having a much reduced sentence. I think the max is like 5 years now. Live to fight another day. Sure, it's a bad precedent and all these other things, but I'm sure that they just crunched the numbers and figured that was the best play. What are your thoughts on the current situation now with Samourai Wallet?
Yeah, I think you summarized it very well. I think, I just kind of almost like add a bit of filling to all of those points. So I think the first thing I would say is, I think it's kind of fine to share this and all that, but I'm pretty sure that the plea deal that they took was around the same time, for example, as the decision for the Tornado Cash trial. And for the listeners there, that's a very separate, but there's a lot of parallels with some of what those guys were being sentenced for, and of course the nature of the activity that was being done, which is providing a privacy service on a transparent protocol. And so I think when you have an opinion of the plea deal that Samourai took, I think it's worth keeping it in the context that there was a decision that had to be made without necessarily the full picture of what was happening in the Tornado Cash trial. And I suspect that the prosecution, either they were trying to bank a win at that point, or who knows, maybe there was some noise kind of up in the political chain to kind of wrap these cases up or whatever. And, not that the plea deal, I think, was seen as too much of a win by anyone, and certainly probably least of all by the guys that are going to be, serving that sentence. As you quite rightly mentioned, it could have been 25 years. The fines could have been dramatically larger. And sure, it was still a hefty fine. I think it was about 6.6 million or something around that. But on the one charge that they admitted guilt to, that has a maximum sentence of 5 years. I believe that the time that they served in house arrest will count towards that. So if they don't get the full 5 years, you could see them get onto a parole far sooner. And so I think, in all of that context, it's certainly to me a lot more understandable why they made that decision. The other thing I would add is, and I can't exactly remember the timeline around the result in the Tornado Cash one, but I think the Samurai Wallet case had some advantages and some disadvantages to Tornado Cash. How that would have worked in an actual setting, which would have had a different judge, a different jury, and one maybe with the knowledge of the other, with that sentence going. I don't know, but the Tornado Cash piece would have been there were certain arguments that the Tornado Cash defense were making around the fact that the application was decentralized and unstoppable, and not all of that was inherently applicable to Samurai's Whirlpool. Now, obviously, someone else has and been able to set up another Whirlpool coordinator, but this isn't something that exists on the chain and is not exactly something with the same parallels as what Samurai had, where they're actually running infrastructure on a server basis. With a Tornado Cash, they could kind of point towards, Ethereum validators running some of that infrastructure, Ethereum relays and all of that. So it's not exactly the same, but there's a kind of similar. And what Tornado Cash walked away with, which I think was a partially hung trial and guilty on the same, I think the money transmission issue that Samurai were, plus like hung jury, I think, on the other two trials. I mean, is arguably a worse result than what Samurai came away with. So with some of those aspects a little less favorable towards Samurai, I think we can look at it and be kind of quite grateful that they did do the plea deal. One thing actually, before I forget about it, which I think is another thing that I actually only thought about recently, is that, we talk about money transmission and the money laundering charges. And certainly from a Bitcoin perspective, I think a lot of us think it's all quite absurd, it being non-custodial. And certainly, something we can talk about a bit later, but Bitcoin not really being money, in many ways it's text, as I've said before, I'm sure on this podcast. But the other thing as well is, when the Ethereum Tornado Cash service was being run, you did have stable coins going through Tornado Cash, which was never something that went through Samurai. So in some ways, it wasn't something I saw that came up on the trial particularly or anything like that. But it was one thing that I actually thought that was a little harder for the Tornado Cash. It kind of was less in their favor to argue that there wasn't some form of money transmission going on, even with all their kind of non-custodial aspects and the fact that it was programmable smart code. Certainly for kind of making that case in the mind of a jury that's possibly not technical, and with some of the arguments that are being stated, I thought that was a kind of an interesting difference between Samurai's Whirlpool and Tornado Cash. And then the last thing, I think I would just make the point, you talked about precedents. There's certainly a kind of form of informal precedents here, but I think from a strictly legal perspective, like a plea deal isn't actually going to be actual precedents. It's not like case something that you could be used in case law. But I think as something that I think we can agree on here is obviously it's a chilling effect for anyone else trying to launch either that type of technology or similar forms of technology or other things that involve co-signing even for infrastructure. We've seen kind of potential concerns around, Lightning node operators and all that. It's certainly something that's going to be, at least until the US either has additional legislation that comes through, or there's something more than, for example, the executive orders and statements from, I think it was the Deputy Attorney General, there, like that's really going to put, I think, a lot of brakes on innovation and the advancement of privacy tech in the US with that. But yeah, and I think, as you said earlier, like I think it'll be November that we'll hear that. Obviously, the fine is already known, but we'll get an idea of how much time they'll serve. And obviously, fingers crossed, it's really, I'm fingers crossed that it's time served that they've already done and that they can just be out on parole as soon as possible and get back to as normal a life you can after such a horrible 18 months and a crippling fine and unfortunately a criminal record.
We're going to, in this discussion, folks, we're going to get to knots. I do think knots will be a potentially a blip in the radar in the bigger cause for privacy in Bitcoin. So we're not going to overemphasize that. Let's get into a deeper discussion, though, Max, that you hinted at. You have in the past talked about Bitcoin as a kind of like a check system, okay? Not cash, not digital gold, but and I thought that was an interesting way to put it. It's kind of like halfway between those two things. Now, of course, Satoshi calls it a cash in his white paper, but that's in the that's a long time ago, and obviously things evolve. What is let's get into this discussion, and maybe along the way you can explain how OP return fits into the conversation about what you actually see Bitcoin as, which is kind of a big deal. Like, what is this thing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because we all use definitions to help articulate our points and to make sense of things that we see and observe. And I think one thing that pretty much everyone can agree on is it's not easy to describe Bitcoin. It's not easy to have analogies for it. And certainly, when I was first reading about Bitcoin, and that would have been over 10 years ago, I was just trying to understand it. And of course, I was trying to understand it without using it, which is always a challenge then. And I think that's a very typical way for most of the recent cohorts to come into Bitcoin. You read mainstream media articles. It takes a while before you maybe kind of get some more unique points of view that come from people that are either gifted with describing things, or they've actually got an engineer's mind or an architect's mind and actually understand what they're talking about. But I think it's kind of back to definitions. Without wanting to go too much into a kind of a side point, but people talk about Bitcoin being money. And it's actually kind of funnily enough, even I think today on Twitter, George Selgin, who's that wonderful monetary historian, he wrote a kind of great book on private money. I think it would have been now I'm revealing it's been a while since I've read it, but I think it was 17th century. It's kind of in England, but kind of he's written a lot about monetary history, and I think even he would have been quoted by Hal in the early days of Bitcoin as one of the kind of looking at ways that Bitcoin might evolve. But someone like Selgin doesn't believe that Bitcoin is money. And of course, it's a kind of really intense belief held by a lot of the kind of the Bitcoin maxi types that Bitcoin really is money. And actually, it kind of comes down to it. And you've got to think, what is the definition of money? And, lots of things can be used as money. But is your definition of money something that includes whether it's widely used or widely kind of accepted? And I think once you start getting to those definitions, I mean, they're absolutely criteria about whether something is money or not in the minds of most people. But I don't think when you kind of go to large kind of statements and broad statements of that, you necessarily do yourself a favor when you're looking at how what's best for a system and how to use that system. Also, kind of the fact that currency and money are used super interchangeably. Currency tends to mean for most people notes and coins, and typically something fairly official if you kind of go for the more mainstream interpretations. And actually, you'd get from most mainstream interpretations, they wouldn't classify Bitcoin as a currency, yet we term it in mainstream media, certainly, as cryptocurrency. So it's obviously some form of currency. And in certain jurisdictions, I think El Salvador, if that's still relative now, or Central African Republic might have been another one. You've actually got a classification of Bitcoin as like a legal tender, which that is another form itself. But my kind of point here is that all these terminologies you can use, and they can be kind of quite broad statements. And in any kind of discussion, they can have different meanings and context for the people that discuss it. But I think it's still important to kind of think of what Bitcoin really is when you actually look at it as it is, and obviously what it was intended to be, and what the current set of core developers that maintain that software, what they intend it to be. And unfortunately, there is no real one answer, and there's a few. And I'll kind of go in order, I think, of what all of those are. So I think kind of number one is, what is it now? And it's definitely a database. It's a consensus model, so it's a shared database. It's a replicated database because when you interact with it, you keep a copy of it yourself, but you definitely append to it. It's obviously made up of text. It's not money in the fact that it's sanctioned by governments, or it's issued on the basis of being backed with anything. But it obviously it requires that proof of work to create in the first place. And then but yes, it's not obviously just like a regular database like a PostgreSQL or a MySQL database, because to append to it, there's a consensus to append to it, and you're utilizing digital signatures when you're appending. So yes, it's a database, but it's clearly not just an ordinary database. It's a bit more special than that. What did Satoshi seek to achieve? I mean, the white paper itself, which I don't think you should necessarily take as the kind of the all authoritative view. It was written at a snapshot in time, and obviously there's a whole bunch of other posts that Satoshi's written in places like Bitcoin Talk and forums, and money is used as a term when he describes Bitcoin, but certainly in the white paper, I think it's a helpful phrase to kind of imagine. He doesn't even necessarily describe it as cash. He describes it as a cash system, which I think is an interesting term, because that's not really a term that's kind of used very often. And the way I like to think of it is that Satoshi set out to build a cash system, a system that replicates what you and I use day to day in terms of cash, which takes the form of kind of coins or notes. He's set to replicate that digitally. And of course, if you seek to replicate something that's a very analog, asset of some sort, you try and recreate that digitally. You can impersonate it. You can try and get as close to it. But naturally, that design, when you try and do that, there are going to be differences. And I think it's pretty obvious to everyone here that the cash system has very different trade-offs and attributes than regular cash. And so what I like to think of it is that Satoshi tried to design a cash system. People can use that as money. And certainly that was definitely the intention for people to do. And I think broadly the core development team that have taken over, which is obviously a very broad set of individuals with differing views and all that, have set out to continue to make a cash system. But there's been other things that have been included as well. And even before, I know the question was about the OP return field, which is that free text field to do. Things had already changed from what I would classify as a cash system, even before some of those kind of debates over the OP return. And I think they go back earlier in Bitcoin's history. And certainly for the listeners here, please do validate what I'm saying here, because I wasn't during discussions at that time. It was before I was into Bitcoin. But something I kind of understood since is the inclusion of script into Bitcoin. And by that, I mean, what we would mostly here kind of be familiar with in script would be something like a multi-sig. So, having some kind of basic logic, like 2 of 3 of these public keys that I set out in the, as part of the address. That is something that has a kind of spending, some form of threshold or some kind of logic in that. I think that was a much earlier time that Bitcoin departed from being just a cash system and became something a little bit more, or if you wanted to argue, almost diluted for some people what its mission was. And the reason I say that is because in the earliest days, when you paid to an address, I think, my memory's a little hazy on this, but I think you may have even been able to pay to like this kind of raw public key. There may have even been a potential address standard that had an IP address in. I think that was super early. And then, of course, it kind of moved to what's now known as like a legacy script, but it's a script hash. So, public key hash, not a script hash, a public key hash, which is like your old one address type thing. And, that was, very regular. You use a public-private key pair to generate. But once you actually had script and like multi-sig, I think a couple of interesting things happened with Bitcoin there. Is you've now got like a very basic smart contract in Bitcoin, and you've also got, in my opinion, what was the beginning of the worsening of privacy in Bitcoin. So obviously this was prior to kind of some of the chain analytics companies. You didn't have kind of wide use of coin joins or any of these other kind of privacy features. But at that time, once you started including additional address types into the Bitcoin blockchain, you can kind of imagine like a kind of fractured address graph that could be kind of viewed. And what I mean by that is, if, for example, you're paying someone with a different address format than the address of the UTXOs that you're using, that can stand out on chain and make it more obvious that you're paying someone else. You've got kind of a worse aspect to privacy there. And I think the other thing that's really interesting here is when you've got multi-sig, I talked about this kind of a basic smart contract. It's ostensibly there to obviously improve security. I think that was a big thing at the time because I think Gavin and maybe even Amir were kind of concerned about people kind of having their Bitcoin hacked because it was all very kind of hot networks that are being used at that time, and people kind of being able to get hacked, and they saw this kind of ability of adding a threshold of spending in as a really important way for people to get faith in Bitcoin as an asset that you could secure. But of course, once you introduce some kind of smart contract, you've now got that potential for, say, like an escrow or something. And I think that's an interesting departure because at that point, you've now got cash system, but it's not operating like cash anymore. Like not in any definition of it for me. There's no form of cash that I'm aware of. Like a £10 note, for example, that you cut up, and you put together if a certain kind of contract is fulfilled. And this is really obviously when you've got like something in the electronic version of cash and you move from, you've now got something that actually you're what I would call, and it's possibly not a fair term, but I'm going to kind of use it anyway. You're almost building like an application layer logic into Bitcoin, because an escrow service in the real world, as in like the kind of the physical world, that would be something you potentially leave in someone's custody, or maybe you kind of share kind of keys, but you're going to have a kind of an extra person involved, like typically to kind of administer that. But with Bitcoin, you can really use a protocol to enforce that. And I think that's kind of, a very interesting departure of when it's less like a cash system and more of a kind of smart contract. And, hate to use the term, but you can kind of, financial instrument 2.0, this kind of idea that you can kind of embed smart contracts of some kind, even and have spending kind of conditions. I think kind of Bitcoin changed very early on, even with the introduction of that there. And then I suppose bit of a monologue here, but I think the last thing kind of really to add is kind of on the OP return is this was seen as a way, I think even back then, of being a place that people could store data in that wasn't going to force people to write arbitrary data in other ways into the protocol. Now I don't know the timelines around this exactly. It's been a while since I've read into this, but certainly kind of in some of the earliest days, and I think it's things like the counterparty protocol, made use of and very early days, you could use like the addresses and the scripts to even embed in arbitrary data. And so something like with that specific field that you can view as like, I think of it like a kind of a memo field or something like that. It was seen as a way to kind of encourage people, if they are going to put in like data that's not really related to the Bitcoin transaction itself, put it in there. It's kind of free format field that can be used. If you want to embed like a hash, there's something to anchor to. Like maybe you want to, I think proof of what's it called? Proof of there was a good website. I think it was kind of stamping proof that you could put like a timestamp in. The name will come to me later. But, you could do a transaction and using the blockchain, prove it happened at a certain time. You could prove that you maybe had created a document or an image because you embed that hash into the blockchain. And that kind of use case certainly was kind of quite a popular one. You do that on this OP return field. It's something that can be added to the blockchain, but for the users that don't want that data, they can prune it, i.e. kind of remove it from the database after downloading it. So, it doesn't affect actually the kind of the structure of the UTXOs in the database, which is where your wallet is going to be able to kind of create its own balances. And over the years, that OP return field has been used for a variety of purposes, not just like anchoring other protocols to it, but layer twos can utilize it, and we've seen kind of NFT type protocols use it, and of course, what typically I kind of tend to talk about is a couple of privacy protocols. We'll use it to either assist in recovery of data and to kind of prove that a payment was made. So super kind of long-winded there, but there's obviously a description there of how Bitcoin has changed quite a bit over the years, but also kind of around some of that kind of original intention, I think, behind the field, and and that's largely stayed static for many years in terms of kind of how that's been used. Although Luke Dash Jr., the Knots core developer, has certainly kind of had differing opinions than the majority there.
appealing to Max Tannahill, the commentator slash historian. BIP 47. Why was it so controversial?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, speaking to different people, you get slightly different opinions. I think all of them have some weight there. I think I think number one, at the time that BIP 47 was being proposed, you had like a kind of Bitcoin Cash, and yeah, it was a block size debate. And the individual that did propose that BIP was definitely on the Bitcoin Cash side, which made, I think, some people innately hostile to that idea. So I think, there are, I really don't think it's controversial to say, but there are cliques in Bitcoin like anywhere else. There's people that are friends, they've got aligned interests, and there was already kind of big splits happening. Within that kind of within the communities of Bitcoin. And so when you have a proposal that's from someone that you may be opposing on other ideas, I think it's quite natural to have some of that skepticism. I don't think it's necessarily fair, but I think that's kind of quite a bit to do with it. And that was Justice Ranvier, who I think was one of the authors, or if not the only author of BIP 47. But I mean, there are obviously quite a few others involved in some of the implementation of it later as well. I think ostensibly one of the reasons for not liking it was I think Luke had a broad couple of objections. This is Luke Dash Jr. One was Luke didn't like arbitrary data being written to the chain anyway, and saw it as innately kind of wasteful, which is to me a very kind of odd perspective in itself, because when you do create that data in NOP return, you are paying for that data. So I mean, this idea that anything is wasteful is a bit inherently odd to me, because the individual who makes the transaction decides whether it's worth making a payment or not. I mean, taking a side kind of a point here, people have had different ideas about what it means to be dust. Is it an amount that's unspendable? But when you look about dust or spam, people also kind of think about, is it worth making that transaction? I've seen all sorts of definitions. I've seen people saying about, oh, well, if it costs you more to send than the actual value, then that's spam or that's wasteful. And of course, actually, it's not. If you need to transact even one sat, and it's going to cost you however many thousands of sats, if you need to get that sat to a destination in a unsensible way, and you're prepared to pay the fee, in my opinion, like, that's just not wasteful. It's up to the individual that pays it. And I certainly see the same with when you're creating data on the OP return field. The other thing is specifically about this OP return data is that it's not required in part of the BIP 47 spec, although because of the nature of the implementations, I think afterwards and the way it was default going to go, Luke kind of was very kind of hostile to that even being a way. But I mean, really all it is about storing the public-private key pair between two counterparties in a way so that it being on the blockchain, they can actually recover that, because those addresses and private keys that you kind of establish in that payment channel, you need to know who you've connected with to recover those assets. And of course, actually writing to the blockchain, this is also going to come into our broader discussion on knots and the nature of data on Bitcoin, is that we all know that Bitcoin's an immutable database, but also it's enormously resilient database that ideally should be around kind of forever, right? Or at least kind of in our lifetimes and beyond. And with the economic incentives to of this chain that you append to continually and you don't delete because you need to kind of keep that state, it's an obvious place to put the information required to recover your wallet when the individual private key or seed words aren't enough, because you can store that in this irrevocable or immutable database there. I think, and the last thing that I'm aware of, just off the top of my head, that would have been a reason that BIP 47 would have been controversial, is that it utilizes some form of address reuse. Now, address reuse is frowned upon typically because it's bad for privacy. But in this actual instance, I think it's a pretty, even to this day, I think it's a very novel way, because the address reuse is done to what's called a user's notification address. And so when you actually do this, you want to connect to a user and pay them, you extract that notification, or your wallet extracts that notification address from their payment code. you write the kind of the op return data in a transaction to that address. But that doesn't have to be, that there's no reason that that transaction is then associated with any other transaction that you do. You can use a different UTXO, for example, to pay that person, and then on chain, that's not going to tie together. Secondly, just because you make a connection to that person doesn't actually mean you're necessarily going to transact immediately anyway. And because there's nothing that stands out about the addresses that are derived from that BIP47 payment code. And this is an address reuse kind of used in a way where you're only revealing who you're actually connecting to, but you're not actually revealing that person is necessarily connecting back to you or anything like that. So it's a very limited kind of disclosure of information publicly. And certainly if you've got a wallet that has a good kind of coin selection algorithm, and it's also a kind of a wallet maybe that has different accounts in it that can help you segregate your coins in a way as well, then when that BIP47 protocol is handled in a wallet that's good, it's a remarkably kind of useful way to pay individuals, and it doesn't involve like kind of much of an overhead. At a database level, for example, to track those payments. So it's a pretty kind of novel way. But yeah, those would have been the three main kind of I think criticisms of it. And I think as well, although I wouldn't say this is an actual criticism of BIP47, Luke and the way he was running the bit process was pretty authoritarian, and something that many people don't realize now is people see like the bit process as something that you kind of pitch your ideas on and then get approval for. Like, it was never designed that way. When Amir Taki put that process together, it was modeled off I think it was a Linux kind of similar thing. I forget what they called that, but it was it wasn't completely kind of unique to Bitcoin. But the idea was it was a way of having an idea and having a discussion about it. And the maintainer of that bit list wasn't there to pass judgment and say, nope, this isn't it or anything like that. They're there just to kind of get the numbers, do some housework, and with the list and put it together. So I think the other thing that made it also sting, that kind of criticism, is it was done in a way that may have convinced some people that there was a need for approval and all that, whereas of course it didn't. And as we certainly see with BIP47, and we also see with other protocols such as BIP39, which there are all sorts of comments about like not wanting, they become kind of de facto standards for their respective purposes. If you want to do reusable payments, BIP47 is clearly the way most users are using that kind of aspect in Bitcoin, if they're not using server-side generated addresses. Although there are other schemes recently that come up, there's no indication that they're getting any kind of real use. And obviously with BIP39, we've seen that use, and that's the kind of the seed word format. Even though there are a lot of criticisms for it, it's just become one of the de facto ways of storing your private keys, or as a format to manage your private keys, and not just in Bitcoin, but across like multiple altcoins as well.
Going to the home turf of Max Tannahill, which is x.com, there is a post here. This is from November of last year. This is BC 1984 Adam. And he's making this point, Max. He says, 1 billion Bitcoin users any day now, but only 187 million UTXOs. And then he has a chart here showing the UTXO set size as just under 187 million UTXOs. Your thoughts on this post and what it means?
Yeah, I think there's actually, it's such BC 1984 is a really great follow. Technically, very kind of good, tweets, and like he's a really knowledgeable guy, and he's quite hands-on as well. I think far more technical than me. But that in its post kind of does, really, there's a lot of meanings to me that suggests. Number one, it shows this completely contrast between what Bitcoin can scale to actually at the database level versus people's expectations. This kind of idea of mainstream adoption and, getting kind of so many of the world's users and all that. You can actually see really that after kind of, however many years now, what, 16 is it now? 15, 17? God, it's 2009. Yeah, so 16 years of Bitcoin. We are only at that level of UTXOs. And there are real limitations on given the block size at the moment and how many transactions you can get in the block. There are real physical limitations of the actual chain at the moment to how many new UTXOs that you can create and have users, actually kind of have Bitcoin inside of. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. I think the other interesting thing about that post, of course, is that UTXOs aren't the same as users. So, it's quite easy, especially for kind of users that kind of do spend their coin a lot and they've got wallets that have good coin control. I think it's pretty typical for an active user, especially using like an advanced wallet. They can easily have between 50 to a few hundred UTXOs in that wallet. So, of course, when you actually now think of how many users there are, if you take that UTXO set and you divide it by 50 to 100, that would drastically reduce the number of real users that you're seeing. And I think the other thing as well is that there's been a massive expansion of the UTXO set with some of the kind of the inscription use. And so I think if my memory serves me correctly, protocols such as I think the BRC20, which is very loosely a kind of an attempt to emulate the ERC20 on Ethereum, where you kind of create a kind of some kind of token there. Those are in the nature of their transactions. I do believe, I think my memory is serving me correctly, that they do use the Ordinals protocol to kind of create ownership. They're creating kind of dust-sized kind of UTXOs as well. And so again, like you've got people actually, creating what many would see as uneconomical sizes of UTXOs because they represent tokens. So they're viewing the Bitcoin protocol with their own protocol, which is creating a certain kind of behavior. And I think when you look at the nature of the transactions that have created those UTXOs, that even further reduces really like how many kind of users you've got. And of course, there's that competition, of course, with users transacting at periods for protocols other than what Bitcoin was originally intended to be used by, and certainly by the developers of Taproot and who introduced that, and how it's really is being used and how it has been used there. So I think it's a really interesting set of stats there that makes you think about some of the narratives that you hear about Bitcoin and kind of brings back kind of what's really happening when you actually look at the chain versus what you might appear to think should be happening or is happening when you see some of the narratives being spun on Twitter.
Now, Max, I don't know how much of a romantic you are, but there is somebody who goes by Kit_Sats on Twitter. And this person posts a lot of very insightful things, really gets into the really important questions of Bitcoin. And one that they recently posted was this quote, "My ideal date? We don't talk. We just watch the mempool by the ocean, toes in the sand. He sends me 21 cents and never explains why." How would you rate that date?
Oh, yeah, it's gonna have to be a 1 or a 2, I think. I rate that pretty lowly. I mean, credit for getting outside. I presume that they're together in a physical setting and they're not doing it online. So credit on that. But yeah, I think when you've got what is really just I mean, hey, we're all interested in Bitcoin and love it, but when you've got something that's taking on that aspect in your life, yeah, that's kind of sad. Look, for me, I think the best thing about Bitcoin isn't these kind of odd things to look at that are just kind of I think these will come down to kind of it's idolatry, right? It's kind of that, and again, it'll always be a tool for me. So, if it was viewing the smouldering remains of government because we've successfully used Bitcoin to opt out and it's all collapsed, that would definitely get a good few more points on the romance scale because there's a cause and something to believe in rather than the simple aspect of the system itself.
All right. Well, okay. So Max is not a romantic, confirmed. Now, let's get to the maybe the meat of the subject here, Max. I want to get your updated thoughts on knots. From what I've seen, there's a lot of people who are really up in arms about Bitcoin knots. And my initial reaction is I would have loved to see people up in arms about Samourai Wallet getting arrested. All these people just assembled around this particular cause, up in arms about Samourai Wallet getting arrested or the need to change Bitcoin to add privacy features or things of this sort. But no, it seems that people are assembling and have created this mini cult within the cult, trying to get knots to become the main thing of Bitcoin. What is your updated thoughts? By the way, people have a you retweeted this article by Jameson Lopp. I can add
Mm.
this to the show notes. Not a serious project, and he mostly is explaining why it's weird that people are following this character Luke Dash Jr. when they shouldn't be. You've had some back and forth about knots and the importance of it or lack thereof on Twitter. Maybe you could get us up to speed on the conversation here and what your view of knots is.
Yeah, sure. So I think if anyone is kind of bit sitting on the sidelines or they're not kind of fully aware of the history. Something that people might be surprised is, why I would like retweet. And when you look at that Jameson Lott piece, why it doesn't shy away from being basically a hit piece of Luke Dash Jr.'s behavior and is very much like going for the individual rather than even really particularly the project. Although there is a bit of that as well, because it talks about the difficulty of auditing the code and the fact that there is only one maintainer. But I think it's kind of important to know that, certainly kind of the individual's preferences and politics, especially in a project that's basically being maintained by one person, is important. Sure, you can look at the code, and the code speaks for itself, but Luke is an odd character, and I think I think many people now they could do with being reminded about some of the odd beliefs he has, and that he does largely sit out of consensus on a number of things, and he's a quite honestly, his ability to be pretty dishonest about things and justify them to himself by making up his own definitions of words, and being incredibly resistant to having an earnest discussion about them online. He blocks liberally. You could see that often even and it's not just dealing with people that are out to kind of troll him on Twitter, but to kind of esteemed Bitcoin core contributors, he will just write a single word liar, just because he's kind of invented his own kind of interpretation of that. So I think as much as it might seem a little unfair to really go for someone like that, I think it all is absolutely warranted, because he is such an odd guy. And I for one was pretty pleased to see that, because really the only people I saw calling out Luke and his behavior and his tendency to be kind of authoritarian, with the projects that he's kind of managed and with his attitude towards other people's transactions and whether they kind of fell into a classification of spam or not, were actually the Samourai Wallet developers, who obviously ran into his kind of ire with their Bit47 work and over a number of different things. And you could already see that that they're being kind of right from the beginning. He'd been trying to censor Satoshi Dice type transactions because they were gambling. He didn't see that as a kind of good use of Bitcoin. So I think none of this should really be a surprise to anyone. And it is worth understanding what makes him tick, when you look at like how, if you are intending to run knots, or do that. Before I kind of say too much about kind of my opinion of the knots and all that, and I think it's something that many people kind of don't understand is that you can criticize knots without being a huge fan of the core development team as well, and that's certainly kind of where I sit. As obviously Gabriel, we did a podcast, I think it was a couple ago, about kind of my criticisms towards the core development team, and actually I kind of even got some feedback pretty understanding from someone from Core. Or, and for their own privacy, I won't kind of say who it was, but I got a pretty nice email about it and was, sympathetic, although saying that, you kind of have to understand that the position that they're in and all that. And, although I have been critical of Core, it's, the project's not gone in the direction I would like. At the same time, Bitcoin is a difficult beast. I mean, that's an understatement to manage the code base of. And of course, it being the first of the software project of its type, it's all very easy for someone like me to say, oh, I wish Bitcoin was more private and it could do this and it didn't go in this direction. But, you have got to put yourself into the positions of those individuals at the time to look at, to try and understand why certain things happened. And there was always a reason. And like, this has been a very conservatively managed project. So that's kind of one thing I would say is like, I'm not, a huge fan of Core, but I certainly see kind of the Knots project as just something, as Jameson Lopp's article was, as something just incredibly unserious, mainly because of the individual himself, but also because, there isn't, it doesn't even represent to me anything that's actually going to materially improve Bitcoin in any measurable fashion. What do I mean by that? I would like to, even though this was something that Satoshi was not a fan of, I would like to see more use of implementations other than Core, for example, because I think it helps with Bitcoin's decentralization. Satoshi had kind of quite famously put any other implementations, I think, as being like a menace to the network. But I think, times have moved on quite a lot. And, I think when you've got at the moment, this single project that really kind of does define consensus for Bitcoin. If it does represent a vector of attack. If, for example, you've got special interests, government pressure, you have got a set of core developers and maintainers that you can target. Now, not to say that is as easy as, you bribe this developer and you can change Bitcoin, because it's a very open process of contributing to Bitcoin. There is no one here that's like, that is like necessarily a project lead. There are project maintainers, but they won't, put a patch in or put a change of code in unless it's kind of seen as like wide consensus. So even then, but if you did have other implementations that were much more widely adopted, if you wanted to, for example, put in a soft fork, so let's say something like Taproot, you would actually have to get consensus now amongst a completely different implementation team as well, to much more of a degree than there is now. Now, this isn't to say that there are no other implementations. There are implementations such as Libitcoin, BTCD. I think Bcoin is still in existence, but it's just not being run to any large degree. And there was a time that Bcoin, which is a JavaScript implementation of the Bitcoin reference client, was being used by like a large merchant in the space called Purse.io that are no longer around. But when you've got like large economic actors like exchanges, like large merchants, large custodians, anyone that's kind of really going to represent a large part of economic power, validating those transactions, if they were using different software maintained by different teams, and I mean teams, not by like some single individual, then I think that Bitcoin would be just that much more decentralized. And it's certainly something that you see more of even in the Ethereum space, where there's, I'm showing my lack of knowledge in Ethereum, but there's I think there's kind of clients like Prism and Geth, I think it is. So I should know better. But like there are other kind of clients, and where in that space, for example, even large institutional clients will actually seek to have more than one reference client if they're running multiple validators, because because of the risk of having like a single client maintained by a team that has a potential bug or something like that. And that's not something we really see in Bitcoin. The only real kind of, I would say, reference client diversity is like which version of Bitcoin Core you're using, and that in itself is a form of decentralization. It obviously kind of mitigates the kind of threat of a single update being a menace to the network and causing problems. Like overflow bugs or anything like that. But at the same time, there are bugs that have kind of been in play, been in the code over several versions. So in itself, it's not any kind of form of guarantee. So from the Knots perspective, there, I think that's it just doesn't fulfill that kind of hope. The other thing, I mean, we can obviously talk a bit more about kind of specific aspects of Knots, but a big kind of aspect of Knots is really is how it's differing from Bitcoin, and whether it's yes, the code base is slightly different, but it is forked from core. Lop's article himself goes into some of the differences and some of the odd differences with Knots and core that really don't make a difference. But obviously, the thing that's making most of the discussion on Twitter and all that is basically the filters and the default settings there. And one thing I would stress it to anyone here is if you are looking at running Knots because you don't like some of the defaults that core is providing, I would still recommend that rather than downloading software from an individual who's not maintaining it on a particularly secure server, and this is one individual, so I don't know what the continuity is if something were to happen to that individual, him being incapacitated or unavailable for some time. But you want software maintained by a team. But if you don't like some of the defaults that are on core, you can stick to older versions of core, or you can kind of edit those defaults yourself. So I would say is that if you are looking at at this, is do think about the reasons why you're particularly attracted to core. And then I think lastly, what I'd say on the Knot stuff is that there's this kind of huge belief that these filters, and they obviously do have an effect. Filters, they are default behaviors. They impact how people make default transactions. Someone like Lauren MT has done some kind of interesting kind of tweets on that. I don't think it's always the most helpful to have it under the argument that filters do work versus they don't work, because people's ideas of what do and don't work are slightly different. In Laurent's kind of definition, which I think is absolutely fair, but it's not quite always a definition I would use, it would be something like, they do work because if you've got filters that have like a kind of minimum relay, or they've got kind of a certain amount of bytes, you notice that the transactions that have been created over time fit within the filters, the defaults that have been done by core software. But then the other aspect of the argument, part of this is, depending on how you define works or doesn't work, is if you really want to run past the filters, you can, send your transaction to a miner directly. You can have a set of nodes that are kind of relaying differently. And what we've seen, certainly kind of when you look at kind of the history of Knots has had a different OP return default than core. And with so few miners, using Knots, and if you have a transaction that is over 40 bytes, something I'm familiar with would be like a Whirlpool TX0, like that kind of staging transaction for a coin join, or you make a BIP47 connection, the impact of Knots is just irrelevant. Like, you broadcast something with a higher number of bytes in the OP return than Luke's default software. Your transaction will get routed around plenty of other kind of core nodes, and it'll be included in a block there. Obviously, kind of recently, Ocean Mining does provide templates for miners to use. Luke's defaults of Knots, but I have to say, I mean, when you do see those blocks being mined, I mean, they've not got like the required hash power to kind of materially delay transaction confirmation for any period of time. But you can certainly see there, when you look at Knots blocks that are being produced, they're drastically different to the expected block as if it were core. And at least from my perspective, like, I think it's insane to set your node like that when you're not materially having any impact on the relaying of transactions. Even if you get a widespread number of individuals running these nodes, while you've got miners and other large node operators running these nodes, you're not going to stop the transactions, making their way to a miner to include them in the block. And of course, the biggest effect, as a user, is that your mempool on your node is that lens to see what is about to be confirmed in Bitcoin when you to be on the next block. Of course, that's super crucial if you're creating a transaction and you want an accurate fee estimate. So to kind of purposely exclude transactions that are going to impact the most likely miner to include that in the block. You want an accurate mempool that really reflects what is going to be in the blockchain, because that's going to help you construct a transaction that gets into the next block, which really, like, I think is going to be most of the time the logical way you're going to create a transaction. I really do believe that. If you don't, I don't think it's particularly sensible to craft a transaction at, say, like the lowest sat per byte, and then just leave it in the mempool and hope it gets confirmed at some point, because it can be volatile. It can kind of move, and you could just suddenly find you've got a transaction stuck there for days, weeks, or even months. When you spend a transaction, try and get it into the next block. And if you too expensive for you, then that's probably a time to kind of consider whether you kind of check back another time to craft that transaction. So I think it's I think with a lot of the drama and the kind of the marketing around knots, it really kind of it's not going to achieve what they set it out to be, in terms of dissuading any of the transactions that they don't like to see. It causes a material problem for you if you're actually transacting with it. And this isn't like it doesn't add any decentralization to Bitcoin, which for most people that are using Bitcoin, they will understand that greater decentralization is useful in Bitcoin to mitigate against attacks.
Always appreciate your thoughts on these things, Max. Let's just wind us down here with a cultural question or two.
Yeah, sure.
A simple question: have you got your BritCard yet?
Oh, in the queue, waiting. Yeah, it's not great to see, really, and unfortunately, I think feels a little inevitable. Although at least it's probably the weakest government that we've seen for a while, and there could be some cross-party opposition. So yeah, maybe it'll be just this sheer unpopularity. The government will kind of tie itself in with the ID card. But as much as I think the British are a little different to the continental Europeans with their attitudes or historical attitudes to this stuff, I think if it was sold the right way to the British people, they could certainly end up adopting it.
There is actually a pretty interesting character called Banksy, who is a pseudonymous English-based street artist, political activist. He apparently created a mural recently on the London's High Court, and it shows a judge with a gavel basically beating a protester on the ground. And I thought it was kind of interesting that he was portraying the judge, right? The judge, not the police or something, but the judge as the one doing that. That shows, I would say, a little bit of a. Usually, people are not going after the judges and the judicial system. Now, we've also seen things in the UK where a comedian was arrested over 3 tweets, right?
Yeah.
And you see these stories of people getting arrested just for tweeting out, and it's very weird, especially let's say for Americans, to see some people getting arrested. Like, what is it like to live without guaranteed free speech, let's say in a constitution or something like that? It must just be a constant sense of fear and anxiety just sharing your thoughts. It's gotten pretty crazy, hasn't it, in the UK?
First thing I say on that Banksy mural, I actually forgotten that it was the judge kind of wielding it, and I don't know if this is intended, but it kind of leads to a kind of point that possibly some people forget about. Is sure, the police are not doing a particularly good job. And that's also another understatement, I suppose. But actually, like, the judges are the problem here. Sure, the police aren't good at all, and it's a pity as well, because I think of certainly when I grew up, the average British citizen's relationship with the police was far better, than I think, compared to somewhere like in the US. The US has had like a lot more of a confrontational style of policing. I don't know all the reasons for it. I actually think Hollywood hasn't helped, where kind of art imitates, or it's like life imitates art. I also think the fact that you've kind of got successive generations of military veterans joining the police, when I think of those two things as like very different jobs, as particularly kind of helpful here. And of course, this kind of habit in the US of palming off old military equipment. Or say old, it's actually in pretty good condition, like from say like the Iraq War, and given some county sheriff's department like an armored personnel carrier or something, like I just think that's kind of it's just so different to originally how the UK police were. I think certainly in the last kind of 10, 20 years, there've been a variety of reasons, but the UK police have been kind of increasingly politicized. I think the diversity kind of method of hiring has kind of changed the makeup of the police. The nature of kind of career officers and things like that. I think you've got graduate schemes where people don't really spend the time on the beat like they used to. I think has kind of changed the nature of the police. I think there's been more centralization of police forces, but the police are significantly worse today now than they were, and the nature of UK policing, probably with also some of the terrorism aspects, kind of changed that nature. And I think unfortunately the UK, as a result of some of the kind of the early terrorism in modern history, and so this is before 9/11, but before the Islamic terror threat, to say is even with the IRA attacks, you already had the beginning of CCTV cameras in London. So like this isn't an entirely new thing. The UK being a bit of a surveillance state, this has started much earlier than the US and the Patriot Act. It was already going on before. So I kind of say that. But back to my point about the judges is. This is a huge subject in itself. I'm not the authority on it, but if anyone is interested, the person really to listen to is actually someone I used to kind of read a lot of back when I was doing a history degree, was David Starkey, who's become a bit of a recent political commentator. He used to do a lot of stuff on the Tudors and the Stuarts, that period of history, of English history. Great historian, bit of a character, but he kind of got cancelled a few years ago. I can't remember what he said. I think it was probably something perceived as slightly racist, but now he's kind of on YouTube, and he's quite involved in talking about recent developments in the UK. This is going to have a point to it. He's great at pointing out actually how much of the UK's constitution changed from the 90s onwards, and particularly with Tony Blair as Prime Minister. And it's kind of hard to kind of overstate how much damage Blair did to the traditional institutional structures of the UK. You had the creation of a UK Supreme Court, which never existed in the UK's kind of constitution. And I use the constitution, fully intended it. It's an unwritten constitution, but the UK does have a kind of constitution of institutions and precedent that make the way. And the judiciary itself has become heavily politicized. And so, you've now got judges in the UK making far more of kind of an interpretation of what they think the law should be. That never happened before, and a lot of that is as a result of the changes that were made to the UK with the establishment of the Supreme Court. A lot of the reduction of power in the House of Lords, which, yes, although it's a kind of a second house, is not like the US Senate, for example. It was always like a revising chamber and consisted of a lot of individuals that, yes, they were often kind of former politicians, but they weren't party affiliated to the same extent they would have been in the lower house, in the House of Commons. So they could kind of vote with their conscience, and they could vote on things that they cared about and interested them. So you've got like a real kind of change in the way that the law is done. And again, for any of the listeners here that are interested in that, watch Starkey's videos, I would say, on that, because he does understand, because of the history. If you do want to understand, like, the British Constitution of the state, because it is very unique. This is a set of institutions. Britain hasn't really gone through much in the way of revolution. Yes, there was the English Revolution, but many, many years prior to kind of some of the European revolutions. And largely those institutions have gone through kind of slow evolution over time. And it was until recently, I think, a remarkably robust system. Didn't always work perfectly by any means, but it did produce pretty good laws. And the relationship between individuals and government was far kind of better than it is now. As to your kind of question about what it's like to live in that. Well, I actually don't know, not living there. Being in Singapore, there's Oh, certainly on paper, it's seen arguably worse free speech in Singapore. But of course, there's a lot fewer arrests in Singapore for infringements of kind of speech. But then I think what you're probably seeing in the UK with the sheer arrest numbers, yes, it's an indication of how tyrannical things are, and the police bumbling their way with the interpretations of law, and the laws themselves sometimes being pretty poorly, enacted, and and when it comes to court, judges, making some really bad decisions on that. But I think what you're looking at when you look at the arrest record is you're looking at still a nation of individuals that haven't really come to terms with what the country has become. Because actually, there are a vast number of people speaking out, and I think if you look at these videos of, which are now infamous now, of heavy-handed police in a slightly kind of comical way, turning up with kind of high safety visibility vests and often looking completely unsuitable for the part, and threatening to kind of take you down to the station, or taking your children away from you for all this stuff. The vast reaction is incredulousness from the average British citizen. They're not expecting it. They are actually in a state of shock, bordering amusement, and then kind of reconciling the serious nature of this. And so I think, if this doesn't get reversed soon, I think it's actually going to be more worrying when the arrest numbers potentially go down, because then you might now be in a position where people are actually policing themselves before saying what they want on social media. And I don't think we're there yet in the UK. I think people do, have got this kind of muscle memory of living in a free country where you can say what you want. But if this goes on for much longer, you're going to start seeing people kind of police a lot more. And I think that's when you potentially end up kind of changing the culture of the country. Because certainly where I live now, I don't think it's really controversial to say, but amongst the kind of it's predominantly Chinese country I live in, it's a far more conformist attitude, and it's a less of an individual society, still a kind of Confucian value system here, and so the kind of that primacy of the individual is not the same. Obviously there's things people feel strongly about, and the government wouldn't move against, because there could be resistance here. So it's not to say that where I live now you wouldn't get resistance to some government intervention, but certainly on kind of some matters there's a very much accepted level of intervention people are happy to put up with, and to kind of and for them to not say their thoughts on some things. But it's certainly pretty worrying in the UK now.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Max Tannahill, for joining the show. And if people wants to comment on anything that's been said, feel free to jump in the comments. Max Tannahill is very active on Twitter, so you can start following him, commenting on some of his posts in a respectful way, and start the conversation there. Just want to get his thoughts out into the ether. I think he represents a very important subsection of Bitcoin. And Max, I'm going to give you the final thoughts here. We'll have a link to your Twitter profile. I think that's the only link that you really give out. And just any quick final thoughts.
I think if you're certainly kind of new to Bitcoin, you're coming across some of this drama, have a look at the arguments either way and decide for yourself. I think we should probably all remember here as well that there are probably some big financial incentives somewhere along this, and that's not always the kind of, you can always follow the money and work out the flows. But certainly for me, I look at the kind of the core and not drama, and a lot of it feels inorganic to me. And so, regardless of where you sit on the debate and your feelings towards arbitrary data, written into the chain, be aware of some of kind of possibly what the motivations are. And I think there's kind of, on both sides of that debate, it's worth looking at kind of who's working for who and who's potentially paid for few. You can always, though, as I always say, is you can always exercise caution in Bitcoin. Don't feel like a rush to upgrade your software, and do what feels right as well. Use software that helps you to be comfortable. And my recommendation in all of this is go out and use Bitcoin, regardless of whether you're using NOTs, Core, or whatever. By using it, you'll actually be able to ask better questions. And certainly, kind of, if you approach me, I'm always kind of happy. If you disagree with me, as long as it's kind of there's a question there. It's that you want to kind of understand my motivations. Absolute pleasure, and I enjoy, and I've learned a lot. And certainly, kind of, if you look at who I follow on Twitter, I'm definitely following people that are running knots. I'm following people that are adamant about running core. I don't have always the most varied set of people, but I definitely try and make sure I kind of see kind of different sides of the argument. Final thoughts there, and just lastly and most importantly, keep an eye out for the samurai sentencing. I think also keep an eye out if they end up spending time in a prison in the US. Keep an eye out for things like the Free Samurai account. I'm sure there'll be details on how you can financially support those guys if they're away, in the same way that we were able to do with someone like Ross Ulbricht. So please keep an eye out. Just because the trial's over, or the trial didn't happen, because the plea deal's done, that fight isn't over, and all the attention you still provide to them and any kind of financial assistance is still really important. It's absolutely gutting to see what's happened to them. I think we can only hope that sympathetic sentencing, and also that maybe in the US some laws rather than just executive orders can be put in place that provide a bit more protection for developers releasing software such as them, because if it turns out they're the only ones affected, and part of their effort has been involved in raising these issues, then maybe it was worth it.
And stay tuned to this channel. We will definitely be telling you how you can be supporting Samourai Wallet moving forward. Hey, thanks for listening. I could really use your help real quick. If you could share this episode with someone, engage with me, leave a review anywhere. This helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, newsletters, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.